Hi, my name is Tatiana, Freedom Bridge Tantra, and I'm going to be doing monthly book reviews and summaries of books on Tantra and sacred sexuality across the whole broad spectrum. And this month I'm going to start with this great book. It is Tantra Illuminated by Christopher D. Wallis, and I love this book because it puts forward a very positive philosophy of life. This book was written by Christopher, who is a scholar of Sanskrit, of India, of Indian history and culture, who has been teaching and practicing for many years. And this book is the first of its kind because it's been written not for the academic but for the general audience. And even though it's quite a long book, it's 500 pages long, it's very well structured, and the complex philosophical ideas are accessible to the layperson and the general audience. So this book concerns itself with the history and origin of so-called classical Tantra, primarily focusing on Tantra in the medieval period between the 8th and the 12th centuries. And Tantra came out of a dominant religion in the Indian subcontinent called Shaivism. And according to Christopher, when Tantra is translated in the original sources, it means Tantra is something that spreads wisdom that saves. Sometimes it just gets translated as doctrine or book, because originally the first evidence that we have of Tantra in written form dates from around 1,500 years ago, and the Tantras were a set of books called the Tantras. They're different, and at the time people would have asked, which Tantra do you follow, because there were different schools of thought on it. Now today Tantra often gets translated as weaving, looming, expansion, etc. And according to Christopher, these words are homonyms. In other words, they have the same spelling in Sanskrit but a different meaning, and none of these words, none of these translations were used in that sense in the original sources. So in the original it means something that spreads wisdom that saves. There are two main currents to classical Tantra, the right hand current and the left hand current. And this book explains that the right hand current was much more mainstream, it was more institutionalized, it emphasized the worship of Shiva without the female counterpart of Shakti, whereas the left hand current was much more transgressive. It encouraged women to practice, it worshipped female deities, including Shakti and a whole host of other female goddesses. And the main difference between the right-hand path and the left-hand path was that the right-hand path for a long time was dualistic, which means that those practicing the right-hand path of Tantra believed that God and the manifest universe and the individual soul were all separate entities, whereas the left-hand path believed that there is only one reality and that all is one, and that the only thing that exists is God. And actually these philosophical ideas influenced the popular 60s ideas of there is one consciousness, there is one reality, and few people know how much influence the original classical thought and philosophy has had on modern ideas. So some of the key philosophical ideas of non-dual Shiva Tantra, which is what book primarily concerns itself with, is that there is one God, and that God is the only thing that exists, and that God manifests itself in this reality. So all essentially is good. The only thing we can do is identify or misidentify with our true nature, which is peace and bliss and calm. So when we identify with our true natures, we experience a state of ananda, peace and bliss. And when we misidentify with our true nature by using I am, whatever statements and limiting ourselves, that can lead to mental suffering and unhappiness and anxiety. So essentially the key message is that there is no problem unless we think that there is a problem. And these complex ideas are laid out beautifully in the book, and I highly recommend for anyone that is interested in exploring these in more depth to read a copy, because they are laid out in a beautiful way. These ideas are presented through the philosophy of non-dual Shiva Tantra, through looking at the 5 acts of God, 36 tattvas, the 3 impurities, and this is something that can be explored through reading the book. At the time, this philosophy was spread over a very wide geographical area of what is now modern India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, Bangladesh, and even parts of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And it's amazing that today this tradition has nearly died out, although through the work of scholars like Christopher, it is being resurrected and it is coming back into the mainstream a little bit more. As he says, it has passed through the eye of the needle. So the original Tantra, to practice the original classical Tantra, one had to be initiated into the tradition, one had a guru, one undertook a daily practice and worshipped deities to identify with the deities, and it was very widespread to use mantras, yantras, and mandalas. So generally, according to the author, there is no connection, or virtually no connection, to the more modern Tantra, so-called neo-Tantra, which Christopher says was introduced to the West by teachers such as Pierre Bernard, starting in 1905, and Aleister Crowley, who sexualized the practice much more. So modern Tantra, when people hear the word Tantra, it generally refers to something to do with sexuality or sacred sexuality, or the connection of sexuality and spirituality. And I think it's important to point out that the author says that very little of original Tantra is to do with sex, and those rituals that are sexualized in classical Tantra have virtually nothing in common with the modern workshops, modern tantric workshops. So I think it's a misconception to link classical Tantra to modern neo-Tantra. And the reason why we call ourselves Freedom Bridge Tantra and use that word, because we do concern ourselves with looking at sexuality and sacred sexuality, is because I think the word Tantra is here to stay in the West. It's too well established now. There are too many workshops, there are too many people that have written books and used the word Tantra in this new, more sexualized form. But I think it is important to look at the history of Tantra and to distinguish that, yes, there is a difference between classical Tantra and what gets called Tantra today. Now, this book is excellent for anyone who wants to learn about the history of Tantra, who wants to learn about classical Tantra, anyone that's interested in the practice of yoga, anyone that teaches yoga or Tantra, and anyone that's interested in Tantric Buddhism, or anyone that is interested in philosophy, especially having a very positive philosophy on life. So get this book. It also answers some really interesting questions, such as what came first, Tantra or yoga? What is the origin and original meaning of the term Hinduism? And also answers some of the age-old philosophical questions, such as, if God is wholly good, then why is there suffering in the world? And a whole host of other interesting questions. If you'd like to read a longer summary of the book, please click on the link below the video, and you can read some key quotes and the key summary of this book. And I'll be back next month with a review and summary of another book. But now remember that you are beautiful and perfect just as you are. Have a beautiful day. Namaste.